if you're messing with role questions, those questions sound like, the statement that Los Angeles is quieter during Corona times played which one of the following roles in the argument above? And in my experience, students brutally overcomplicate these role questions. They way overthink these role questions. And so I want you to respond to a role question with three questions of your own. So the first question is it the conclusion? Was the statement that Los Angeles is quieter in Corona times, was that the conclusion of the argument? Yes or no? If the answer is yeah, that was what they were trying to prove, you're done. It's the conclusion of the argument. You go into the answer choices looking for, it was the conclusion of the argument. That's the answer. Game over. If it's not the conclusion of the argument, you go on to the second question. The second question is, okay, well, is it evidence? You know that that statement was not the conclusion of the argument. Well, does it support the argument? Was it a thing that they brought up expecting you to assume that it's fact, and then that fact justifies, helps to justify this conclusion of the argument? Is it evidence in favor of the conclusion of the argument? Yes or no? If the answer is no, and by the way, this is the answer like 90% of the time on role questions. It's either the conclusion or a premise, and that's it. If it's not the conclusion, and if it's not a premise or evidence, sometimes the correct answer is it was something else. So that's just the third thing. Is it like, something else? And there you can frequently articulate what that something else is. Often that something else will actually be the opposite of the conclusion of the argument. It'll be like, no, they brought that up, but that was the thing that they were trying to disprove. So it wasn't the conclusion, it wasn't evidence, it was actually the opposite of the conclusion of the argument. Then, with that in mind, now you go into the answers. If you're looking for the evidence, then an answer that starts with like, it was the main conclusion, you're just like, nope, goodbye. Or if you know you're looking for the conclusion, it was the main conclusion, and the answer starts with like, it was a principle used to support you're like, nope, it wasn't used to support, it was supported. Okay, now, the one time where this kind of gets confusing, you'll be looking for a premise of the argument. You're like, it was a premise. I know that this was used as evidence to support the conclusion. It'll feel like it was a premise, and you'll run across an answer that says, it was used, it was a conclusion of the argument, but not the argument's only conclusion. Or it'll say something like, it was a subsidiary conclusion of the argument. It was an intermediate conclusion of the argument. Evidence was provided for it, and it in turn supports the conclusion of the argument. Those are all answers that describe what we call an intermediate conclusion or subsidiary conclusion. I never predict that in advance. I don't bother thinking about intermediate conclusions and subsidiary conclusions in advance. I only do that if the answer choices force me to. There will be an answer that says it was a premise in support of the argument's only conclusion, or there'll be something that describes one of those intermediate conclusions. And then I have to look back at the argument and determine whether, like, wait a second, did they give evidence for this thing? Like, I know that this thing is not the conclusion, and I know that it supports the conclusion, but did they also provide evidence in support of it? And I'll look through the argument, and if there's no evidence in support of this thing, then it's not an intermediate conclusion. But if I do find evidence in support of this, and it in turn is used to support the conclusion of the argument, now I can pick the answer that says it's an intermediate conclusion of the argument. But I'm never going to get into any of that bullshit unless the answers force me to. Cindy, I hope that was helpful. I think that's about all I got to say about roll questions.